User administration and the user environment. In this nugget, we're going to look at commands and tools that we use for user administration in Red Hat Linux. I'll first refresh your memory of the basic commands that we learned in the introductory videos for adding and deleting and modifying user accounts, and then we'll look at some graphical user interface tools that do the same thing. And then finally, we'll talk about the user environment, and specifically the bash environment and the configuration files that bash uses to set up your user environment. So let's get to work. Well, let's just start by reviewing some of the commands that we learned back in the introductory videos to do user account management. Alright, so the commands that we learned back then were user add for adding an account, user del for deleting an account, and user mod for modifying an account. And we talked about various options for those commands as well, so that you could use the commands to their fullest potential. Okay, so let me first switch over to be the root user here, and then what I'm going to do is use the user add command. Before I actually add a user with that command, I just want to use the capital D option and hit enter, and to see the various defaults that are used for the user add command. So here it says the default group is 100. The default home directory is /home. So if I add a user account like Annie, for instance, then the home directory for Annie will be /home/Annie. Okay, inactive set to -1 and expire is blank. That means these two fields are not being used. So there is no account expiration by default. The shell by default is the bash shell, and the skeleton directory by default is /etc/skell. And if we do a listing on the /etc/skell directory, you'll see the various files that are in there. And these are all configuration files. The first ones are like bash logout, bash profile, bash rc for the bash shell, and so on. Okay, so these configuration files are put into the user's home directory. When I add the user, these files will be put in there verbatim. Okay, so each of these files has some basic configuration information in it, and those are going to be copied to the user's home directory. Okay, so that's basically the user add command. So if I do something like user add Annie, okay, now let me go to the home directory and do a listing, and now I've got this account there. I've got this directory there named Annie. Alright, and if I go into the Annie directory and do a listing, a complete listing of that directory, you'll see the exact same files here that you saw up here in /etc/skell, and these files are the same word for word as the files in /etc/skell. They were just copied to Annie's home directory, and now Annie has ownership of these files, and she can change them and change the aliases or change the various paths or whatever is in these files. She has ownership of them and she can change them. The only reason they're in /etc/skell is it just gives users a starting point to mess with configuration files. So they have the basic configuration files in place right when they have their account initially. Okay, so that's the user add command. If we look at the man page for user add, you can see there's a whole bunch of options that I can give for the users. Okay, I can add a comment to their account when you look it up in the password file. I can make a different home directory than the one that's going to be given to them by default. I can set an expiration date, a group. I can pick a different skeleton directory. I can actually set a password in there. I can set a shell, what shell to use, what specific UID if I want them to have a particular user identification number, and then finally I give their login name, like Annie for the last example. And then you can see with the capital D option, that displayed the defaults when I just said user add -D with nothing else. But I can also give options to with capital D, like -G for a default group or -B for a default home. And then what I'm doing is I'm changing the defaults for all future user adds. Okay, so if I set the default home directory to be slash whatever, then all future users home directory will be under slash whatever. Okay, so that's the user add command. Let's quit out of here. A quick little refresher on that. Then there's the user modify command. Okay, so one thing for user mod, for instance, I can do is I can set a password. Okay, so let me just set a password. Linux is great. Okay, so here's my password, and I'm going to set that password for the user Annie. Alright, so now I do that, and now Annie has a password set, and her password is Linux is gr8. Okay, so that's one thing that I can do with user mod. Again, let's just look at the man page for user mod, and you can see all the various options. And it's basically the same options we saw with user add. It just lets us modify the user's account after they've already been added. Okay, again, just a quick little refresher of the user mod command. Again, we're going to quit out of here, and now let's look at the man page for user delete. Okay, for user delete, the only option for user delete is the -R option, and what that does is it actually removes all the user's home directory files, okay, along with the home directory itself, the user's mail spool, and it gets rid of the account out of the password file and everything like that. Okay, so that's the only option for user delete. So if you just wanted to delete the user's account so they can't log in, but you wanted to keep their files around and so on, then you would not use the -R option. You use the -R option if you want to wipe the user out off the system completely. Notice that there is this little sidebar here that says files located on other file systems will have to be searched for and deleted manually. So if that user owns files in other places besides their home directory, then you're going to have to look around for those and delete those manually. Okay, so there's a quick little review of the 3 commands that we learned back in the introductory videos: user add, user mod, and user delete. Now let me show you some graphical tools that you can use for account management. It's sort of a catch-22 here, in that I'm going to show you these tools, and they're nice tools, and they make adding and deleting and modifying accounts very easy. But it's a danger, because by showing you these tools, I don't want you to wipe out of your mind all of these commands that you've learned to do account management, like user add, user delete, user modify, and more commands that we learned back in the introductory videos to mess with groups and so on. Okay, so I want to show you these tools because they make life easy, but those other commands are useful for a variety of reasons. Those commands you can put into shell scripts, so you can automate the process of adding a whole bunch of users or something like that. Those commands will work even if a windowing system isn't working on your machine. So if X Windows isn't working on your machine right now, you can still do account management with those command line tools, but you will not be able to use these GUIs that I'm showing you if there's no windowing system working on your system. Okay, so that being said, I'm still going to show you these graphical tools because I think they're nice, but keep those other commands sort of fresh in your mind because they are useful in certain situations. Okay, let me show you the first tool here, and that one's a Red Hat config users is how you get to that tool. Okay, and this is going to bring up a window with all the information about the users on the system. Okay, now you can see right now there's only 2 accounts, the Perry account and the Annie account. You can see the primary group for each of these users is a group by their own name. Remember that Red Hat uses what's called user private groups by default. We've talked about those in the introductory videos, and we'll talk about them more in these videos too, just not right now. Okay, so if I want to add another user to the system using this graphical tool, I just simply go to Add User, click on that, and now I get this dialog box and I just fill this stuff in. Okay, so let's add a new user to my system. All right, we're going to add, the username is Charles, and the full name is Charles Barkley. Okay. So there's my new user account. I can fill in a password for Charles. And notice it comes up with stars so nobody can see it over my shoulder. The login shell is set to bash. It's going to, this is checked, so it's going to create a home directory named Home Charles. It's going to create a private group for the user Charles, and that's it. Okay, I don't want to specify a user ID manually. I'll just use the next user ID in line, and it should come up to be 502. Since I'm 500 and Annie's 501, Charles should turn out to be 502. Okay, so I'm going to say OK here. And now the user account Charles is created. You can see his full name's Charles Barkley. The home directory is Home Charles. Okay, so that account's been created. More than just this account being created, the same thing happened when I did user add with Annie. /home/Charles contains those configuration files that are in the /etc/skel directory. So just because I didn't use user add directly doesn't mean that the added features of user add didn't happen. All this tool does, all this graphical tool does, is call user add under the scenes and gets the account created. Okay, and so all the things that user add does sort of by default, this tool does by default as well. Okay, so the new account Charles is created, and Charles can now log in, and he'll have that set of configuration files in his home directory. Now notice this Annie user here does not have a full name set, because I didn't do that. When I typed user add before, I just said user add Annie, and it gave her a user ID, it set up her home directory and some stuff like that, but it did not give her a full name by default. Okay, so I can give Annie a full name using this tool. If I just highlight Annie, double click on this line, anywhere on this line, you'll see the whole line highlights, and now this properties box up here, I can check on that, and now I get another dialog box where I can add information for the user Annie. So under full name here, I can type Annie's full name, Annie Hall, okay, and I'm going to say OK. And now you can see Annie Hall shows up in the full name field of this user Annie. Okay, so managing users with this graphical tool is that simple. Okay, if we go over to groups, you can see the different groups on our system. And basically there's 3 groups set up, the Perry group, the Annie group, and the Charles group. These user private groups are set up for each of the users by default. Okay, so that's it basically. The Red Hat User Manager makes adding and modifying and deleting user accounts that simple. One thing is if I want to delete a user account with the Red Hat User Manager, I can highlight the field and then I can click on delete to delete the account. One thing that the User Manager does not do is delete the user's home directory and things like that. Remember, if we wanted to do that with the user del command for user delete, we would have to say user delete -r Charles. Okay, that would delete Charles's account and would also delete all the files and directories in /home/Charles. There's no way to do that in this graphical tool. So that's one of the reasons I said that the command line tools are better, because they're more comprehensive. All the options are available to you from the command line, and they might not be available to you in a graphical user interface depending on how it's built. And the way that this one is built, you cannot delete all the directories and files in the user's home directory when you click on delete. Okay, so that's just a word about this. But otherwise, this tool is very simple for adding, modifying, and deleting user accounts. Okay, now I want to show you another tool, another graphical tool that you can use for account management, and this is the Webmin tool that we installed when we were doing the Red Hat package management video. And so in that video we installed Webmin, but we didn't really use it, and now we're going to actually use Webmin for a particular purpose, and that purpose is to do account management. Remember, you get into Webmin by opening up a web browser and then typing in your local machine name followed by *10,000. Okay, the local machine name in my case is Nugget, and I've already got this in my history, Nugget 10,000. Notice also I've switched over to use the Conqueror web browser instead of Mozilla. A friend of mine really likes Conqueror and was telling me some stuff about it, so I decided to just switch over to it and use this temporarily. Okay, so now we get into the Webmin screen. I'm going to log on as root and type the root password here. Okay, and now oops, I typed it incorrectly. There we go. And now I'm in the Webmin interface. Now if I want to do user account management, I go up here to the System tab, and then under there, if I scroll down, I can see this thing, Users and Groups. Okay, so I click on that. Now what happens is all the local users on the system are listed here in this interface. Okay, notice how many users are coming up here. And then you scroll down, there's tons and tons of users in addition to the ones that we created, Perry, Annie, and Charles. Okay, so those accounts are what are called normal user accounts. These other accounts that are in here are what are called system user accounts or special user accounts. Anything with a user ID of under 100 is a system user account, and they're not for normal users to log into. They're privileged accounts in some way. Okay, the Red Hat Config Users tool that we just used 2 minutes ago for account management does not display system user accounts by default. It can if you go up under Preferences and set it so that it will display all user accounts on the system. But by default, it only displays the normal user accounts like Perry, Annie, and Charles. Okay, this interface displays them all by default. Alright, so if we want to create a new user, under this whole list of users, there's this link, Create New User. We can go in and create a new user. It brings up another web page. We type in the username. Let's use the username Dennis. The real name is Dennis T. Menace. Okay, and then we set the shell for Dennis. We set it to be bash. The user ID here is automatically set to 503, but we can change it if we want to. The home directory is set to be automatic. It'll be /home/Dennis. Right now, the password is set so that no login is allowed, but I can set a password for Dennis so that he can log in. Let me just use that Linux, if I can type, man. Linux is great. Okay, so you can see that's actually formed from the list. So I'm going to use that. And then down here, I can set options for the password. So, you know, an expiration date for the password, the minimum number of days, maximum number of days that the password can be alive, that sort of thing. Then I can set up group membership. So it's by default, it's set up to be the new group with the same name as the user, like it's been for everybody else. And then there's all these secondary groups that we can put Dennis into as well. And then upon creation, it says, do you want to create a home directory? Okay. Do you want to copy files to the home directory, like from Etsy Skell? And then this other thing is a Webmin question. Do you want to create the user in other modules as well? So Webmin manages all sorts of things. It manages you know, user accounts. It's going to manage web-based, like web servers and the Samba clients and things like that. And if you want to create this user in all those other Webmin modules, then you can click yes. We'll just leave that on as yes, and then we'll just click on create to create this user account. We'll talk more about what those other Webmin modules are as we move on through the video series. Whenever I show you how to do a particular thing in Linux, I'll also show you how to do the Webmin version of that when I think it's useful. Okay, so now here's our local users again listed out in Webmin, and now you can see that Dennis has been added with the user ID 503 and his full name Dennis T. Menace. The directory is home Dennis, and the shell has been bash. Okay, so fine. Webmin versus the Red Hat config users tool, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. Here's why I think Webmin is a cool tool. It's for this particular item here. Okay, so create, modify, and delete users from a batch file. Let's click on that link. So what Webmin gives you the ability to do is to create this text file. Okay, and this text file, what it can do is you can put in this text file, you can create a whole bunch of user accounts at once. You can modify a bunch of accounts or delete a bunch of accounts all at once. And what you have to do is create a line in the file. Each line is going to do either a create, a modify, or a delete. You start the line with one of those three keywords, create, modify, or delete, and then you put a colon separated list of the various things that you want to set when you create an account. So if I wanted to create that Dennis account, I would say create Dennis, you know, the password that I set, Linux is great, the user ID of like 503, the group ID, his real name, the home directory, and so on. And I can create this text file for all the different users that I want to create on the system. Then that text file I can upload. So it's called a batch file. So I'll upload this batch file. I can browse around my system for that particular batch file, and then again, I can check these options as I want to do things to those files that to those user accounts that I'm creating. Okay, so the same kinds of questions we saw before when we were creating a user like one at a time, we can set those things as well for creating this batch of users. Okay, so I think that's a really nice tool to have available to you, and that's a nice feature of Webmin that I wanted to show you. Now we saw when we added user accounts that certain configuration files were put into your home directory automatically, and it was those files that were in the Etsy Skell directory. Okay, so the files that are in there that I want to concentrate on for this discussion are the ones that have to do with the bash shell, .bash logout, .bash profile, and .bash rc. Okay, now there's actually two more files that govern sort of the configuration of your bash shell, and those files are called Etsy profile and also Etsy bash rc. Okay, now Etsy profile and Etsy bash rc are sort of global bash configuration files. They live up in the Etsy directory. Notice there's no dot in front of these files. They're not hidden. They just live up in the Etsy directory, and they are for everyone on the system. Whereas these files, .bash logout, .bash profile, and .bash rc, will live in your home directory, and you can modify these so that your bash configuration is personalized. Okay, now notice I'm highlighting the ones that are in etc skel, but I'm talking about the ones that are in your home directory. Okay, once they're in your home directory, then they govern your local bash configuration. Okay, so now let's clear up exactly sort of the order that these shell scripts are executed when you log on to the system. Okay, so when you first log on to the system, the very first shell that you open runs this etc profile script. Okay, so the global script gets run. Once that script gets run, then the next thing that gets run is your local .bash profile script. Okay, now one of the confusing points here is that this file, the file that used to be run, the name of the local file that would be run used to be called .bash login. Okay, and I kind of like this name more because it gets across the point that this script is just executed when you first log into the system. Okay, if I go to open up a new shell window, like if I go over here and click on a new terminal to open up a new shell window, okay, that does not run .bash profile. It doesn't run /etc profile. These two things are only run when you log into the system. Okay, and if you're trying to figure something out or debug something, if you're talking to someone who's been around for a while, sometimes their .bash profile file is called .bash login. Okay, so that's a confusing point. If both of these files exist, both .bash profile and .bash login, only .bash profile is run. Okay, .bash login is ignored. Okay, so really that's why you should be messing with and altering .bash profile instead of creating a file called .bash login, because profile takes precedence there. Okay, so that's one of the confusing points that I wanted to clear up. All right, so that's the first two things that get done. etc profile is run, and then .bash profile is run. Well, if I look at the basic profile file that's given to everyone on the system, you'll see that one of the first things that it does is it tests to see if there's a local .bashrc file. And if this file is out there, then it runs that file. Okay, so etc profile is first, .bash profile is next. Inside of .bash profile, it's set up to run .bashrc, and then if we look at .bashrc, the local one, let me do the etc skel .bashrc, we'll see in there that it tests to see if the file etc-bashrc is there, and if that file is there and it's this regular file, then it's going to run that file. So etc profile runs, .bash profile runs. It turns out the .bash profile is set up to run .bashrc, and that .bashrc is set up to run etc-bashrc. Okay, so there's this whole order of things that are happening. So sometimes people get confused because they set up some variable, say, in their .bashrc file. And then when they log onto the system, that file, that particular environment variable isn't set the way they thought it should be. And the reason it's not set, perhaps, is because it's set differently in etc-bashrc, and etc-bashrc runs after the local .bashrc, and so it supersedes those definitions. Okay, so if you understand this ordering that I just went through, that'll help you debug some problems like with paths getting set or environment variables getting set or that sort of thing. Okay, now on subsequent shells, when they open, when I go over here and I click on new terminal, for instance, okay, then the whole etc profile thing and the .bash profile scripts, they are both ignored, and you start with .bashrc. Okay, so .bashrc is the first thing that gets run when you go to a new terminal. Now sometimes you'll see .bashrc calling .bash profile or something like that. Okay, that's bad. Okay, if you're going to make calls from one script to another, the only thing you can do is run .bashrc from .bash profile. If you go the other way and you try to run .bash profile from .bashrc, well then .bash profile runs .bashrc and bashrc runs bash profile, la-di-da-di-da, and you see the kinds of problems that you can run into there. Okay, and you don't want to do that. So make sure that you get the commands correct and put the right sort of information in the right files. And let's go over and make sure we understand exactly which information should be in which file. So if we go up and look at the global configuration file, so if we go up and look at the global profile file, for instance. You can see it says system-wide environment and startup programs for login setup. Functions and aliases go in /etc/rc. So if you're going to create system-wide aliases, then that should be in the etc/rc file. Okay? And the same sort of goes for the local side of things. For local aliases, they should go in etc.bashrc. Okay? But for environment variables and things like that, that should go in your local .bash profile. All right. So if we look at, let me just quit this one and look at /etc/bashrc. Okay, this is going to tell you system-wide functions and aliases. Environment stuff goes in etc profile. Okay, so they're trying to make clear here what goes in bashrc and what goes in bash profile, and this goes for the global ones like etc/bashrc as well as the local ones like your home directory .bashrc. Okay, so if you get that straight and you understand the order of these things that these things go on in, then it's going to be easier for you to track down problems that you're having with things like your path and environment variables. Alright, well, it's time to wrap up our nugget on user administration and the user environment. First, we talked about user administration in Linux, and we talked about the commands user add, user delete, and user modify, which we actually learned back in the introductory videos. And I just refreshed your memory how those commands basically work. And you can look up in the info pages or the man pages if you need information about specific options for these particular commands. And then we looked at some graphical tools for user administration. First, we looked at the Red Hat config users command. And that brought up a nice graphical window and gave us the ability to do user add, user delete, and user modified from a graphical interface. And then we looked at that tool Webmin, which we installed a couple videos ago, and talked about how we could do user adding and deleting and modifying with Webmin. And also, one of the nice things about Webmin, the reason I showed it to you for this video, was because it allowed you to do batch adds and batch deletes. So you could create this text file and then load it up into Webmin, and Webmin would add a whole bunch of users specified that you specified back in that text file. And finally, we just talked about the user environment, specifically relating to bash and the bash configuration files that you have both in your home directory and the global ones that are located up in the etc directory. And I tried to help you understand the order that these configuration files are executed in when you log onto the system and when you open subsequent shells. Well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks for watching.